past and try to find something that still holds tradition to move into a future for the context I'm in. And that seems to be, part of the leadership conundrum that you have, on the island. In my island, the central point is Charlottetown. It's the town, right? In fact, we just call it the town because everything else isn't. and you understand that the youth tend to go to town, and that presents a leadership problem. And then you have this, so you'll have one context that wants to centralize all these rural churches into a hub to hold on to something so that maybe we can have the youth stay, in that context. And yet that is a different context than me trying to keep, because I have a small rural church that only has 12 people attending on Sunday, and I need to train lay people to be able to carry that load to make it work so they don't close. Does that all make sense? It's like I have to divide myself in two sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is, part of what I meant by saying we're kind of in a different context where, we've moved from being a church that was easily well funded by its congregation members, that was part of the Canadian fabric, that was an institution that formed and decided a lot of things from medical systems, immigration to education. And now we're on the outside. And yes, we haven't caught up to, and I mean, this is going to affect us all across Canada, most of rural it's such an obvious trend when I look at the ministers I'm serving in the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, maybe the Kootenays. So those are the most highly populated areas in the province versus what it's like to be a minister in the northern parts of BC, who have small congregations, less ability to fundraise, and really need to move to a model where we've got trained lay leaders and really possibly thinking about using the church in a totally different way. But I don't think that, I think that's exactly the moment we're at, and that tension is real and solutions are not. Hopefully we're going to start working on solutions for that, but I don't see that as, I feel that's just the tension moment we're in.
If I could, Rhian, give you an example of what we just passed, worldwide communion on the 1st of October. Okay, well, I trained the laity in my small rural church to have the love feast based on the old Methodist tradition, which does not require an ordained clergy.
Right.
Okay, but my church in town, of which I have 2,000 people, is a different context. Mm-hmm. Okay. So they have a clergy there and probably can support a clergy there full-time on their own. Right. So the tension I have is that the big place says, why doesn't the little place close and come to us? Mm-hmm. You understand the problem? So I'm trying to train the little one to stay open while the big one says, well, they should just come to us.
Right.
Do you understand the decentralization, centralization problem? Yeah. For example, if you take a look at John Wesley, he actually went out to people. That's why there were little Methodist churches in every town, every 5 miles where the stage stopped and where the tavern was, obviously. Mm-hmm. And they built a small Methodist chapel there. But that's not the trend today. Okay, the trend is actually the opposite. So as a leader, how do I reverse that trend to keep my little church of 12 people, who religiously 12 people show up on Sunday, open?
Yeah, great question. Okay, Carolyn, it looked like you were wanting to jump in.
Well, I'm not sure that I need to any longer. Martin answered where I was already going. Rhian named it as a tension moment, and I think it sounds like it's a tension moment between two competing yeses. Right. So if the shaping question of our conversation is how do we say yes to our people? So how do you say yes to the folks in town, and how do you say yes to the 12 people who are, valiantly hanging on to their congregation? And how do you as minister handle saying yes to both? And can you, and do you even want to? And why I say G, I think you answered the question as you kind of wrapped up your last comment, is it doesn't sound like you want to. Like, it sounds like you've got a yes that's aligned with a particular yes, and so you're wanting to explore how to live more fully into that. Did I hear you right?
No, I'm just saying it's a conflict. I don't have an answer, but it requires two different approaches in the same pastoral charge.
Yeah. Great. So
that's a leadership challenge.
Betsy, you were hoping to say?
Yeah, just I do hear that quite frequently in the context of London Conference. We have churches that are like, our youth are gone. You know, we're a small rural church. How do we get more youth? And what I often say to churches is we need to stop trying to force youth to come into our sanctuaries. And rather than just lamenting about the past, instead I encourage congregations to consider, to look in their wider community and to find a need, and to maybe look at where their church can help fill that need. For instance, there was, a situation I had read about where there was a small church in a skiing community that had a lot of young adults and students that would come in for the ski season and either help, run the slopes and different things, ski instructors or whatnot. But they also realized a lot of them didn't have a ton of money. And so the church decided, why don't we host a meal on Wednesday nights? We'll host a meal and invite it open free to everybody. And so they had all of these young adults coming to their church for meals. And then they realized that a lot of these kids, needed some extra socks or different things. So they ended up having baskets of socks. And so the young adults knew this is where I could come for a meal on Wednesdays to gather with people who just wanted to get to know me for who I am. And then sadly, a tragedy struck and a young adult actually died on the slopes in a crash. And that group of young adults that had been coming to meals at that church, because a relationship had been formed, came to that church saying, can we host a memorial service just for us so that we can mourn the loss of our friend? But because a relationship had been created and doors had been opened and that the church went and invited people where they were, this beautiful relationship opened up. Other examples are, if a church realizes we have a building, but we're not getting people into church, maybe look at hosting after-school math tutoring. Like in Ontario, we've got a crisis with math, like our scores are terrible. And so why not get some of your retired math teachers that are willing to come and do some tutoring? Obviously, you need background checks, duty of care, blah, blah, blah. But there are ways to try to, serve needs of the community that aren't just about Sunday mornings. Because what we're also trying to do is to create relationships and also work on stigmas. We heard about, a lot of people have been hurt by churches, to invite people to say, this is a safe place where all are welcome. Come, and then bit by bit you create relationships that maybe they'll end up coming Christmas Eve or Easter, or when a crisis happened, they'll be like, oh, that's the church that I want to go to. Does that make sense at all? Because it's a way of being the church without just being about Sunday morning.
Yeah,
right?
I would say that's a big part of the conversations that are happening in BC, particularly for smaller churches or not so small churches, right? I think you're on to a trend that's coming up. Is how do we say yes to what's happening in the needs in the community and use our church space as that. And then the tricky part is, like, as you referenced John Wesley, how do you thread back the spiritual part, right? The gospel part, and you can't, but you can. I believe you can once you've created that relationship. But if you don't do something to overcome what Christina said about the suspicion, then if you can't build that relationship at all, then it's hard to know how they'll ever walk in. Also, small churches, particularly if you're Fort McNeil and you have 1,500 people, but you have a building, I'm sure there's a need in the community for something, and maybe you could be that as well.
There's also for me can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also for me a wondering of the structure that's so big, and then there's this many people, and the focus on this many people holding up this structure, which just isn't going to work. I mean, Vancouver School of Theology just moved from their giant castle empire, into a smaller building, and like Jesus had 12 disciples, so 12 people is not none, and so it just makes me, I feel quite sad when the people are spending so much time holding up the structure. The structure is not really what we're here for, I think. And I have a wondering about this moment and what we are called to let go of and relinquish in order to gather together and deepen practice, both in ourselves, in our communities, so that we can go out more broadly. But if we're all standing holding up the walls of the church, that's going to take all our time, I think.
I should tell you that the small church that I was talking about is 135 years old and cost them practically nothing. The major expense you're looking at, it's me. That's the problem. Okay, and that's why I'm trying to make it so that it's lay organized. And I mean, even structures like the boards that listed, according to the United Church Manual, it's almost impossible to have with a congregation this small. And we're not talking 1,500 people in the community, we're talking 50. That's it, 50. This place doesn't even have running water and hasn't for 135 years. So there's no daycare going to move in there. There are no meals going to be served there. It's a worshiping community, but they want to worship together. That's the challenge.
So I'm getting this very complex picture of this denomination that we each call home. I'm just like struck by, oh my goodness, what an amazing context that we are being feeling called and being faithful in, and it's really very encouraging and stimulating to hear each of you as you as you're living in this tension of what was, what might be, and all of the total turmoil of that change. So it's very amazing. So we're at 11:18, and I guess I would kind of, as we're kind of moving towards the kind of closing of our time in a few minutes, I just want to come back to the saying yes part, the saying yes to people and possibilities. Like, how do you, for those of you that are in that role, are there any times you feel, like, I'm just curious about the other side of that question, because I think the other side of that question is why do we say no, or where are the contexts we say no, and what's that about? How do we learn from that? Anyway, Carolyn, you look like.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind venturing in on that. So I serve a congregation whose story and context is maybe a little bit different than the trend that I think that we've been talking about on this call, or that we read about, or what have you, across the country. We're a larger congregation, suburban congregation, and it actually sort of seems like some of the decline conversation just hasn't caught up with this particular community yet. And so for that, we are grateful, but it sort of puts us in a bit of a different context. And there are 2 full-time ministers. So I serve in team ministry. There's 2 of us, and it takes 2 of us, and it probably takes more than 2 of us to do all the things that there are to do. And there are lots of lay people who have lots of ideas. And I think that we have a genuine desire to say yes. And then one of the things that stops us is, and so Rhian, I was particularly listening to how your program, you're sort of thinking, oh, it would be great to begin to expand into lay leadership as well. Because one of the things that stops us is, in order for the lay people who want to do the thing, whatever the thing is, and it's a great idea, but in order to get that launched, it takes a certain amount of time and energy from either or both clergy to kind of be able to work with those folks to kind of get something off the ground before we can kind of back off again. And one of the things that stops us, and we try to say yes anyway, but the energy and just the ability to be present and mindful and available when we're doing a very fast Charleston all the time to just keep up with all the things, that's the thing that gets in the way of saying yes. So great creativity shows up and we look at each other like, uh-oh, because it's awesome, but how the heck are we going to actually manage to get this thing to happen? So how do you say yes with any integrity when you just don't even have the space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very real issue.
Like, oh boy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. So the question there is that it sounds like your role, or the clergy's role in that structure, is as the conduit that things have to go through. And I'm not sure I completely understand, why that's the way that is. So I don't, but that's what I'm hearing you say.
And not necessarily conduit in terms of official polity, but just in terms of how it actually works, right? Mm-hmm. Like it actually does have to go through the council, or it actually does have to go through the various structures, but those things always get vetted from us. And even if we're not the ones to say yes or no to that, in an official way, once something starts rolling down the pike, to get it launched requires some of our time and energy. It just does. It just can't. And I guess I wonder if the answer could be that we stop having it be that way, and that things could get launched without our having to, or something else gets carved out of what we normally attend to so that we can actually get freed up to be that person. Mm-hmm. But
Yeah, Betsy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a very real thing you're talking about, Caroline, and I think I hear it also. The other thing I just want to say is that those of us in leadership, and I speak for myself too, I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist, and I have a vision for how I want things to go. And I know that I can sometimes, and I've heard it from other people, have a hard time in letting go of certain things. And I think that one of the gifts we can give, and I actually remember hearing this when I went to Greenbelt with the crew that our moderator invited, is that sometimes we just have to try, and we have to let things fail sometimes. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that we get a lot of great ideas that come up. And I think our hope and our desire is to be like, yeah, this is going to be a great thing, and it's going to be awesome, it's going to be big, and everyone's going to love it. And so we pour a lot of energy into it, and then sometimes it doesn't work, and then we feel like it's because of what we did. And sometimes it just doesn't work, and we have to somewhat be okay with that. And I think giving ourselves permission to, use Gary's quote of just throwing stuff up on the wall, and some of it's going to stick and some of it's going to fall. But I think that's also part of the message of faith, is having a hope to try. And I think that we're on the cusp of this sort of new vision of what church looks like, whether it's 12 people meeting in a big old building with no running water, or 12 people meeting at the coffee shop down the street faithfully every Wednesday morning, gathering in prayer and to support one another and to walk through life together. That may be a different vision of what our church is, and still having the big steeples and the big group gatherings that can happen, but also recognizing that sometimes we just need to try different things. And they may work and they may not, but I totally get what you're saying about the time crunch, because there's not enough. I mean, I worship at a church that has 2 full-time ministers, and they need more staff. There's just too many demands, because there are a lot of great ideas. They're like, can we do this? Can we do that? And it's like, okay, great,
Exactly.
go for it. But then when it flops, it often turns back on the minister. Well, you didn't, blah, blah, blah. So I totally get what you're saying.
Got it. Thanks. And with that, I have to go. Thank you very, very much.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Carolyn. Bye-bye. Rhian, were you wanting to
You're
jump?
welcome. Bye-bye.
Sorry.
What are we saying no to?
We can't hear you. I wonder if you, when you moved your laptop around, did something get turned down or turned off?
So,
Hi.
yeah.
It's getting a little better. Try now.
There we go.
Now we can hear you, I think.
Okay. Yes?
Oh, I wasn't sure if you were wanting to say something in response to Carolyn's comments. No.
No, just you were asking, I was just trying to get back to the question. You were asking us, what are we also saying no to in terms of going forward? That's
Yeah.
one of the things she was answering. Is that the second question we're doing?
Yeah. Well, I was just curious about the intersection with that, because it's easy. I mean, the other side to saying yes is, how is that a challenge? Do you end up saying no? I guess that was part of it.
It's funny. I don't feel any resonance with that question, I guess, because I feel like it's more like hurry up and say yes to other things. Like I feel more like we're moving too slowly, and that we need to actually start throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks and what doesn't. And we need to keep realizing that we've got large churches, medium size, and really small ones, and that the small ones don't necessarily need to be closed. We need to actually support them. So for me, it's more about sales, really, like sending more support on the ground. Like I think that while I don't want to be Anglican, and I definitely would probably be terrible in a bishop model, the grace that I've seen for the Anglicans is that they can marshal things quickly and support, whereas in our system, it's both like very individual and also sort of large and kind of a little, not cumbersome, but I feel like it's hard for us to address this moment sometimes, because we just kind of end up talking about the little rural churches, but we're not sure how to support them, and no one's sure who's supposed to do that because we've made it so congregational. It's the congregation that does the work and support. So for me, it's more about saying yes to new structures, yes to new expressions, yes to no more one size fits all. It's more yeses. Great.
Okay, so I'd invite, just by way of closing, if you'd just like to take a moment and share what has been the gift from this call for you.
I'll keep talking since apparently my caffeine is hidden. For me, the gift is listening. It's realizing there are a lot of people working on this and thinking about it, and I always feel just a little bit more like, oh, thank goodness. Like this is our conversation as a wider church, and I always feel a bit more buoyant after that realization.
Thank you.
I can say I feel very blessed that we have technology to be able to talk to PEI, to BC, all over. And I think we are in this together. I think all of us hold our denomination with love and with hope. And so I'm just feeling blessed to be a part of the conversation and to, you know, moving forward, who knows with the structure of conferences happening, what that's going to look like. But there's a lot of hope left here on the table.
Great, thank you.
I feel grateful to witness the conversational skill in this group throughout this call, and the grace and generosity in that skill.
Thank you. Martin.
I'm just glad I'm not the only one that feels the tension. So as we pass probably the remit that's going to make congregations basically communities of faith, I hope we don't lose the context of a small rural church as still being a community of faith. We want to encourage fresh expressions, but they're also an expression of faith as well. And I hope they get supported, and they do need leadership. And I think we have to come up with novel ways of supplying that support and leadership.
Okay. Well, it's been a privilege. I really appreciate all of your voices, and I keep saying that I'm new to the United Church. I've only been a member for 5 years and didn't grow up in it. So I just feel like I'm really in a new land, stepping out and saying, oh, there's a big mountain, and there's a steep valley, and there's a river, and oh my goodness, you know, it's quite lovely. So it's really great, and I hope that we have opportunity to kind of meet again around this at some point in the future. And I will be reaching out to you as I'm working with Carla and the Edge to see if this is a useful tool going forward. And I really, some of you sound like you're connected with networks, so I would really value your input. We don't want to duplicate things that are already going on, for sure. So part of it is discerning, you know, is there a place for this, and how could this kind of conversation be useful? And how do we get the voices and the folk part of this conversation who could benefit, or for whom, you know, it would be helpful. So I'll probably be reaching out to you for your wisdom in that respect. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great day, and hopefully see you again soon. Check out the calls and feel free to join us for any others that look good. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.